Hey, good evening and afternoon or morning or whenever you're taking a look at this video. But um, it's been a busy couple of weeks for me, taking some classes that are very challenging. And I kind of get a heavy load through the first of the year just to kind of stretch a little bit and to challenge myself just a bit. But what I really wanted to talk about today was I've had some conversations recently in presenting, some phone calls, and some consulting in regards to discipline and how and when we use it. And there needs to, before we dive into a department that might be having some problems or struggling or having challenges with expectations and creating a culture and correcting things. Before we dive right into discipline, which is certainly a critical part of what an officer has to do, based on the guidelines, policies, maybe union contract, whatever those benchmarks are that you need to follow to change behavior, which leads us into why we have discipline. And so before we even talk about why we have discipline, it's important that if you're trying to shift in your organization or you're trying to improve or do things a little bit differently in your organization, it's important to clearly define what discipline is for. So, as I kind of mentioned with policies a couple weeks ago, you need to understand and be able to communicate to your organization what discipline means. Now, in the truest sense of discipline, when we were raised as kids, at least in my generation, it's been different for my children, but it was nothing for me to get a wooden spoon or a belt or something like that back in the 70s and early 80s. Most parents don't do that today. There's better methods of changing behavior. But that was our impression and what we were raised with when it comes to discipline. So sometimes we can be a bit harsh, and our idea of what discipline is for is a bit skewed maybe. So two things I really want you to think about as a fire officer, a fire chief, in regards to discipline. Okay, so number one, discipline is not punishment. Okay, I know it's kind of counterintuitive and a removal from what we have traditionally thought about discipline. Now, discipline in its truest sense should be about changing actions, behaviors, attitudes, things that are detrimental to the organization and or detrimental to the person involved. So if we take a look at what we want to accomplish and we break it down into smaller parts and we think about those things. So before we want to set up a disciplinary action or a disciplinary process, we have to understand clearly and definitively what we're going to use discipline for. Overwhelmingly, discipline in a fire service setting, in a corporate setting, is not punishment, right? Punishment is really not what we're doing. Punishment doesn't do anything. Punishment makes the person feel bad and maybe makes the person think twice about what they're doing, but it doesn't necessarily change what their behaviors are. So as we define and interpret what we want discipline to accomplish, then we can kind of move forward with a process which should be progressive in nature. So what I mean by progressive in nature, it should be so a first offense, and this gets really complicated whenever I am at conferences and in front of a group in person. This is usually a 1 or 2 hour conversation and discussion that we talk about discipline. There's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of ambiguity when it comes to what discipline is and how we handle specific situations. And we do a couple case studies in this that we simply cannot do on YouTube. So to try to break it down in simplest terms, discipline is not punishment. Discipline should be used to change behaviors, attitudes, actions, as so that they don't happen anymore, and that they don't become a problem from that point forward. So, for example, making somebody drop and do push-ups is not discipline. All right, that's punishment. And if we want to instill a organizational mantra or put importance on physical fitness, using push-ups as punishments counterintuitive and counterproductive to what we want to accomplish, because now we're putting a negative connotation on something that we want to try and make positive. Drilling should never be used for discipline. Training should never be used for discipline. Education outside of reviewing guidelines, SOGs, things of that nature, policy should not be used for discipline. Discipline in its truest form is counseling, is a verbal reprimand, is a written reprimand, is a suspension, time off with pay, a time off without pay. And ultimately, discipline is termination. Extension of probationary time could be a form of discipline. But we have to be very careful how we dole this out, when we do it. And there should be a process in place for progressive discipline that's not used as punishment. When we allow people to use discipline as punishment in our organizations, things get askew. Things become punitive. Things become combative almost. When in the truest sense that we alleviate some of the creativity that our officers can have to change behavior. And that's ultimately what the goal is. So as we look at discipline, and this is a huge, broad topic that we're not going to cover in 6 minutes or so, 7 minutes on a YouTube video. But I want to just plant the seed with you that of what discipline is, what it's used for, and how we accomplish that. I'm doing some online consulting, virtual consulting right now, and this is a big topic. This is a huge topic for a lot of organizations. If you're interested in that, hit me up, jholvelman@gmail.com, the new fire officer at gmail.com, and we can work with your organization in a lot of different areas. But discipline's tough. Discipline's hard. I've always maintained, for me personally, if you take away the personal side of things, because most of us are in smaller organizations where we know each other and we've come up through an organization together and we have relationships, and is what makes discipline hard. But if you look at the nuts and bolts of discipline, typically when we have to discipline somebody, there's been a rule broken, there's been a guideline that's been circumvented, there's been something that's black and white that requires fixing. So for me, discipline's been, I don't want to say easy, but simple in its truest terms, because there's been a violation that's been documented, that has been easy to show and prove. I'd much rather do discipline in certain cases, in certain examples, as compared to promotions. And I'll do a thing on promotions later. But promotions, we're telling a group, -1, that they're not good enough. So keep your perspective when we're talking about discipline. And we can talk about this more later. If you got questions, shoot them to me, and I'll talk to you soon.